Here we have our guest, Walter Jon Williams, who's going to read to us from a collection of his work. Very excited for us. Thank you all for joining us. We have events throughout the day. We of course have our lunch event over in the ball at noon. We have panel, we have a gaming event on the same space at 11:30. Like a place of working. And then at 3 o'clock, we'll have panels upstairs in the classrooms, right? In the ACC classrooms. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Walter Jon Williams.
Some more than that.
And during that time, I seem to have produced some books. So, at the risk of seeming like a TV ad, I'm going to go through them all. This is $20. It's been out last year. This is the latest in my Praxis series. If you're going to start the series, start with the Praxis, which is the first book. I mean, you can't read them in any order, but it builds. There's a series on. Last year, by this time, the best of Walter Jon Williams was released from Subterranean Press. It's in, if you can find it, it's in a limited edition signed hardback of 1,000 copies, or ebook. And there's like a $40 difference between the two, so you decide. But actually, it's 200,000 words, twice the size of the average novel, my short fiction. And including all of the award nominees that I could fit in there, and the 2 award winners. And I'm very proud of this. So, I hope you can enjoy it. The reason I have all these, by the way, is I'm donating to the library as soon as I'm done here. And then there's my Pulitzer series, which is high fantasy. And if you were at the interview last night, you might have heard me talking about it. This is a series that just came to me as a bolt from the blue. I was out walking in my beautiful rural New Mexico backyard, and I was gone about 90 minutes, and at the end of the walk, I had 6 books plotted, and the name of my character, and that's never happened before since. So anyway, here it is. First 3 have been released. There's Quillifer the Night, and there's Lord Quillifer. You can see sort of in stature from book to book. I'm going to read from the middle one, because by the time I'm here, the story is so complicated and intricate that it's hard to break something out to read to you. So, and this is high fantasy, but because it's me, it's subversive high fantasy, and I'm in the process of subverting all the fantasy tropes that you've all been reading for all your lives. But I'm going to start with a very traditional piece. I'm going to have Walter fight a dragon. Clearly did not set this up ahead of time. Let's see, just a bit about Quillifer. This is a fantasy world similar to the Northern European Renaissance. They have things like printing presses and gunpowder. And because they have printing presses, education is a lot more widely available than in the Middle Ages. So there are rising young people from the lower orders who are well educated and smart. Quillifer is one of these guys. And so he is a threat to the established order just by existing. And so he has to deal with a lot of pressure from above to keep him in his place, as well as a lot of pressure from below in the form of his own ambition. So he's a court. He got kicked out of court for telling the truth, but he's back after a couple years of exile. And he hears from the queen's younger sister that there's a certain dragon on the loose off the corner of the realm. Berlada and Priscus were the king and queen. Coming going down the walk, surrounded by a bright cloud of courtiers. As soon as I saw them, I realized that while I had been engaged in colloquy with Her Highness, the idea of the fire grate had not entirely left my mind, and I found that I had built an elegant little formulating my thoughts without ever having devoted any actual thought to the matter whatsoever. So when their Majesty's parties joined ours, I bowed to the royal presence, and then I went down on one knee. Your Majesty, I said to Carlotta, I beg of thee a quest. Everyone looked at me in some surprise, and Floria was the most surprised at all. For but a moment ago, I had been engaged with her in a perfectly ordinary conversation with no mention of quests or favors, and now here I was on one knee addressing the monarch. Carlotta looked down at me with mild blue eyes. Her placid face remained expressionless. You may send your petition to the Chancery, she said, and turned to sweep along the path for her guard. Your Majesty, said I have no petition but to be allowed to fight the fire drake that endangers your Majesty's subjects and their property. The Queen paused, and a shadow of surprise passed across her face. She looked at me again. I offered her my beautiful apprentice face and an apologetic smile. I believe fighting dragons is what knights are for, Majesty. Well, Carlotta absorbed this, another man came out of the crowd and knelt on the path to my left. I beg your Majesty's permission to accompany this knight, he said, in the accents of Loretto. He was a tall man about my height, but with much greater breadth of shoulder and depth of chest. I recognized him as Don Lorenzo de Brest, of Cusero, who had won the prize at the jousts 3 years before that celebrated their Majesties' impending country. I was annoyed at this conceited look abroad, trying to force his way onto my expedition, and even more annoyed as another man knelt on my right. And I, your Majesty, and this man I recognized as the master of the henchmen, Sir Edelmere Wesley. My lover's husband had become very inconvenient in the most unexpected way. I should point out that master of the henchmen was an actual office in the Tudor court. Vexed at this ridiculous circumstance, I said that I intended to take the quest alone, but no one heard me as courtiers were scooting me from left and right to join us. Apparently, questing was the new fashion, like breathless hats and huge scarlet heels. Among the newcomers, I saw Don Memorino Tormil, the Loretan knight who sat beside me at the forgotten dinner and urged me not to tempt his impudence. Carlotta looked at the drawing path with what seemed to be amusement. After a baronet tried to join us, the Queen said the quest would be for knights alone. At the end, there were 12 of us. The Queen wished us all luck and went on with her ladies to the barge. King Priscus lingered a moment surveying us and then looked at me and smiled. I hope at least one of you has read the rule book, he said, and then laughed at his own joke. After the king left, I rose and invited the others to my house to plan the expedition, but none cared to hear me, and they wanted to wait until the breeze, engaged in animated conversation. At the end, I stood more or less as I had begun, with Gloria and her ladies. Gloria's face was split in a merry smile. I thought you said you didn't know how to kill one of these beasts, she said. Nor do I, but I shall find out. She laughed. Gorge it with those idiots, she said. Indeed, she said, you will have the fangs of a royal queen of Iceland. And then she paused and smiled. Not my sister, of course, she added, but my mother. And then she and her ladies laughed and drove their merriment all the way to the royal barge. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead. He does a bit of research on dragons, which just is entirely confusing. Let's see. Of these 12 knights, one of them manages to get killed before they even leave town. So they're going to go away. Not that anyone felt like singing as we left the crossroads and turned southeast along the right bank of the Dordel. The rain pattered on my broad hat and on the oilskins I wore over my old Cheviot overcoat. The river was gray and turbid and speckled with raindrops. We came to an inn mid-afternoon, and as Edward was tired of riding in the rain, the decision was to halt. I viewed my bed with a careful eye on the alert for fleas or lice, but this close to the capital, the inns were very clean. That evening in the common room, the others were polite, for the most part ignored me. Some were the sons of lords, and most were knights of the great orders of chivalry, whereas I was a mere knight bachelor and the son of a butcher. No king or queen knocked me on the shoulder with a sword, and I wore no ribbon across my chest. I wore a duke's ransom on my fingers, but no one was interested in buying gems, and I had not dropped my strongbox in any case. Yet I had been knighted for military service, and on the Iceland knights I was alone. The rest had received the honor on account of their birth, but the great majority had been knighted on the occasion of Carlotta's ascent to the throne, when she had handed such rich compliments to the sons of her followers. The two knights of Loretto had fought in one or another of King Enrico's wars, though I understood that they had been knighted first and fought after. Lorenzo del Brest suggested that we fight in the order of precedence. We should place him first as a knight of the 7 words, a cousin of King Enrico and the descendant of Queen Margareta of Stegerda. Once this became apparent, the other knights opposed this idea, and we drew lots as originally planned. Sir Brindley Wilmot, the third son of his Grace of Waitsfield, drew first place. The Brez drew second, and I sixth. The Brez seemed content enough with the result. As no one wished to talk to me, I called on Rufino Knott, this is his Bartlett, to bring out the guitars, and he sang and played his extras of the figures while I strummed and accompanied. Well, we made our music, heavens open, and the rain beat on the roofs and shutters. The others played cards and drank. I thought there would be a late start the next day, and I was proved correct. Each night there was more drinking and more cards and dice. I began to think I had joined a traveling carouse and not a quest at all. The only excitement came when Sir Edelmir's horse stumbled while fording one of the Dordel's western tributaries and was pitched into the river. He flailed madly in the water, unable to swim. Aware that irony lurked at the very act of my having to rescue my lover's husband, I turned my falcon and was prepared to launch myself into the river to fetch him out. When two of his own henchmen swam their steeds after him and brought him gasping to the shore, his fine black hair straggling in his face like seaweed. Shivering, he was bundled into one of the wagons and changed into dry clothes, and by evening, having warmed himself with hypocrisy, was laughing about his misadventure. More laughter came later when he lost a small portion of dice. The sixth day, in the forenoon, we arrived at Bonaire, the house of Queen Natalie, Floria's mother, and the third wife of King Stillwell's 4 wives. She insisted on providing us dinner, which dragged on into supper. Her Majesty was not at all disturbed by the existence of the dragon and spoke merrily for hours, pausing only to ask for news of court, which news she interrupted with scandalous reminiscence of those being mentioned. She had a group of ladies to wait on her, and one lean gentleman dressed in a robe of black velvet with a skull cap on his gray head. He was introduced as Dr. Smoke, and he spoke in a deep, measured voice as if weighing his every word. Oh, none of us believed little Matilda was really Count Conrad's daughter, said Queen Natalie, for everyone knew Lady Conrad loved Sir Jasper Terrier, and both he and Matilda had that blazing red hair. Yet Conrad never seemed to know what was going on under his nose, possibly because his affections were directed at Lady Goldner when all was happening. Truly, she was an indiscreet woman, though she never seemed to speak out of malice, but rather because she seemed unable to stem a great flood of anecdotes once it had started. I looked at her ladies and saw that some were straining yawns, but others had a glassy-eyed look that comes with trying to seem interested. I suppose they had all heard this many times before. It has always been an open question whether Lord Fontanus was poisoned, Natalie said, but I suppose when my daughter, the Lady Floria, is finally queen, she will have access to the archives and can find out. This statement so startled all Her Majesty's guests that none of us knew how to respond. Her Majesty saw our expression and laughed. Oh, aye, she said, Floria will be queen. Dr. Smolt has cast her horoscope and assured me that this is true. Is it not against the law, I asked, to cast horoscopes of the royal family to give out the hours of their birth? Oh, please, said Natalie, I certainly know the hour when my own daughter was born, and I am assured that it was an auspicious hour indeed. Her Majesty speaks truly, said Smolt in his ponderous way. He stared intently from one to another of Natalie's guests, judging our credulity. From one of her ladies, I learned the history of Dr. Smolt. He was a sorcerer and a necromancer who spoke to spirits. When Claiborne had rebelled, Smolt had become Berlata's philosopher transtermine. The previous holder of that office, a venerable but tedious abbot named Ambrosius, had been willing to cast spells for the safety of Berlata and the realm, but his holy office forbade him to cause harm through his magical arts, and Berlata wanted magic to blast her half-brother with actions. Smolt was less scrupulous than his predecessor, who was employed for the express purpose of laying curses on Claiborne and his followers. After Claiborne's defeat, for which Smolt was more than willing to take credit, he was dismissed and replaced with a monk. But the crown awarded Smolt a pension, and Natalie employed him in the tower which to conduct his experiments. This seemed unwise to me, and I thought Smolt, with his black robe and staring eyes, was lightly around it. The next day was sunny and fine, ideal for the journey, but the sense of our fellowship was that we would continue to enjoy Queen Natalie's hospitality. Natalie was enjoying our company and did not object, and so the day was spent in idleness, or rather in more games of dice or cards. The games were simple, if not childish, and the sums wagered would have shocked the richest mercer in the land. I could afford to lose, but I misliked losing to a mere cast of the dice and preferred a game with an element of skill. I joined a game of 9 men's Morris and won 12 royals, but then lost it again in a game of box and peace. With 17 of us playing, the 11 knights, Queen Natalie, and several of her ladies. Afterwards, I settled into a game of Imperial, in which, as the game involved skill and I had but a single opponent, I better fancied my chances. Yet Sir Brindley Wilmot, the Knight of the Red Horse and the third son of his Grace of Waitsfield, was a skilled card player, and after several hours' play, each of us having won a number of games, I managed to win but 2 royals, and only because he drank a deal more wine than I and allowed me to trump his name. He gave me his note with ill grace. I think he viewed me as a peacock ripe for plucking and was willing to put up with my undistinguished ancestry for promised amusement and money. Alas for him, I courted him with displeasure. Sir Edelmere Wesley seemed to suffer the greatest losses in the beginning, but he lost with such easy grace that the others were probably encouraged to live more often. Stillwell's former queen gave us a very fine dinner, and then after nightfall, a supper made largely of game caught in Her Majesty's own park. I heard talk going around the table of spending another day upon air, perhaps including a stag hunt in the park, but I had enough of this meandering drunken adventure with a band of interlopers who would not treat me with civility, and so after the last remove I stood and called for attention. I raised my glass and offered a pledge to Queen Natalie, whose noble generosity and hospitality, I said, was matched only by the grace, excellence, and charm of her person. The others stumped the table and cheered. After we drank, I addressed the others of the party. Gentlemen, said I, it's been an honor and a pleasure to travel in your company, but I have set out to kill a fire great, as I have pending business in the capital I propose. I purpose no further delay. I will set out on this quest tomorrow after breakfast, and I hope the rest of you will join me. Sir Brinkley Wilmot spoke up, his pale moustache bristling. Who are you, Sir Quilliver, to decide on behalf of this company? I do not decide for you or for any of these gentlemen. I decide only for myself. I bowed toward Queen Natalie. I'll believe Her Majesty will provide me with one of her huntsmen to serve as a guide. Her Majesty acceded, though clearly both she and her ladies had hoped to enjoy our company for a few more days. I was early to bed after telling Rufino Nunn and the others of my following to have the horse and wagon ready by dawn. I encountered the other nights at breakfast. Many showed the ill effects of the previous night's revelry, and none were in any humor to speak to. I finished as quickly as I could, praised again the charms and hospitality of our hostess, kissed her royal ring, and made my way to the courtyard, where my minions waited with my horses and wagon. Sir Edelmere Wesley had arrived ahead of me and was already in the saddle, supervising his sumpter horses as they were packed. It must be admitted that Sir Edelmere was a capable royal officer who prepared his own part of the expedition with efficiency. He brought along a half dozen of his own henchmen from the royal stables, and they were accustomed to one another and to taking his orders, and did their work well and almost without speaking. And of course, they had acted to save their sheep from drowning. Henchman, by the way, is an ancient title used by the troops of the Royal Majesty. Though as these fellows are available and handy, they are used for other tasks as well. The term dates from the time of the Sea King, and combines man with Hengas, their word for horse. In exchange for this tidbit, you may pass the wine and kiss me. I swear this story is written in the second person, addressed to a lady. Sir Edelmere gave me a jaunty wave as I jumped into the saddle. I looked about the courtyard, dark in the shadows of the great house, even though the sky had grown light, and I saw other knights' followers moving vaguely about their errands. I turned to Sir Edelmere. Shall we move on and let the others catch up? Her Majesty is not yet set for herself for her husband. Dr. Smolder arrived first, padding in the courtyard at this point, velvet robe. I will cast spells for your success, he said, and it will take 3 days. I thanked him civilly, and he retreated to his tower to begin his chanting. In time, the huntsman appeared, a gray-bearded man astride a down cob, but by then most of the knights were ready, and we waited for the laggards and then set off in a troop. I put myself with the huntsman in the lead and set a steady pace till noontide, when I allowed an hour for a cold dinner and a watering place for the horses. Then I was back in the saddle for a long afternoon riding. We were very much in the country, and there were no inns. Under the bright, cool sun of winter, the land seemed prosperous enough. Sheep spotted the pastures, orchards lay on all sides, and the farms were snug and tidy. The great storm of that summer seemed to have spared this country, tucked in the shadow of the fertile earth. The roads were fenced with hedges, and sometimes were near sunken tracks. We were obliged to ford the river, and then by afternoon we were in the foothills of the Cordillery, along folds of mountains and steep hills that formed the spine of the hill. Here there were no great fields, but lynchets only, with terraces stepping down the hills. By this point, the huntsman was out of his reckoning and regularly spurred his cob ahead to give directions. It seemed that the Princess Gloria had greatly exaggerated the danger to her mother, whose worm was nowhere near her face. Before nightfall, we pitched camp in a field, and the grooms took the horses off for water. Soon fires were kindled. Wine was set near the blaze in pots and leather jacks to warm. Pottage was prepared, and sausages and smoked meats were grilled on skewers. My crew set up my tent beneath an awning of sailcloth, and in my good old Cheviot overcoat, I was as warm as a cat by the hearth. Goodman Knott played his guitar and sang the Queen of All Beasts, his smile soaring over the camp. Brinkley Wilmot's eyes glittered firelight from the far side of the camp. Sir Quilliver, he said, I wonder if you will carve this hand. A warning note saying in my blood, clear as a trumpet call. I replied cautiously, do you not know how to carve? I thought it was a accomplishment of all gentlemen. I practice carving the enemies of Her Majesty, said Sir Brinkley. A few practice, I observed, for her majesty and her wisdom is married the heir of our greatest foe, and now she is not an enemy in the world. He glowered, yet I think you are more suited to carve than then I must teach you. I fetched a fork and a carving knife and walked around the camp to where Wilmot had draped himself in a folding chair by his own fire. One of his men had the ham on a skewer with a trotter pointed skyward. First, we must find you a trencher, Sir Brimley said. I cast about for a platter, or at least a slab of cheap bread. But then I saw the knight's armor laid out on a back blanket by his wagon, where one of his following was oiling and polishing it. I snatched up the back blade and laid it on Sir Brimley's lap. He gave a start and made to rise, but I put a hand on his shoulder. Not yet, Sir Brimley, for the lesson now begins. I took the skewered ham from Wilmot's pinion and dropped it on the back. Now rest you, said I, and pay attention, for I will slice you some fine colors. I showed him my knife, passing it close enough to his yellow beard. Now you must, first of all, have a knife of sharp steel, and keep it well sharpened. It need not be one of your thick, heavy bilboes, for you will see soon that while my blade is thin and light, it slices very well. As for control, you must hold the knife with the thumb and forefinger steady in the blade. I thrust my fork into the meat. Now it is said that the trotter should be facing upward, I said, and touched the trotter with my gun. But I find that is not the universal rule. I cut several long slices from the part of the ham close to Wilmot's nose. Fine sizzling portions fell onto the black back plate. The scent of saffron rose in the air, for the ham had been cured in its spice, and its rind was golden. When I had cut enough long slices to make a flat surface, I turned the ham so that it rested on the flat side. Now you see I have made a fine rest for the meat, said I. It matters not how the trotter points. And now we may proceed without accident. For accidents, and here I held casually the knife before his face, the point making lines and circles. Accidents are all too common. I placed the knife against the meat. Had this been warming longer before the fire, said I would cut along the shank, and thus I made some thin cuts down into the bone. But the troy has not been on the fire long enough to be heated all the way to the shank bone. But it is warm in the outer layer only, so I must make some thin cuts along the surface. Cuts this thin take a fine eye and a steady hand, as with observe. All conversation in the camp had ceased. My lesson had become the object of all eyes. Goodman-Knott's song had fallen silent. Wilmot, I could see, was turning scarlet as the cook inquired, and he was gnawing his lip beneath his pale mustache. Words burst from him like bubbles at a slow boil. He cried, "What is it? Be careful, Sir Brimley. You may do yourself an injury." Wilmot snarled, "You, sir, are nothing. You are a base." I pointed the blade straight at his face. Before such words as "Cohen" or "barbermonger" pass your lips, said I, you should reflect that I have a sharp knife, and you do not. I advise you to sit still and learn your lesson. I cut a long series of columns. Steam and scent rose from the backplate. Wilmot trembled in every limb like an angry boar trapped in a pin. I stepped back. "There you have it, Sir Brimley," I said. "You have a fine supper, and I hope you will enjoy it." I began to walk back to my own fire, and there was a crash as Wilmot leaped to his feet and broke the backplate and ham in the dust. "I will end your sneering now, you butcher's son." He walked over his armory and laid out and drew his sword. "Sneering," said I. I backed away, keeping Wilmot always in sight. I stooped my fire and picked up a jack of hot mulled wine, from which I then took a sip. At need, I would hurl it in his face as he charged. "I have not sneered," I said. "You have asked me to slice your ham, and all these gentlemen are witnesses to your request." I pointed around the circle with my knife. "I obliged and gave you a lesson in carving in the most civil way. Yet I am repaid with insults and threats. To this, these men are also witnesses." I noticed out of the slant of my eye that the two sailors in my company had equipped themselves with lanyards, and the Rufino knot had circled around just beyond the light of the fire, and he was carrying a heavy falchion in his hand. If Wilmot ran at me, Knott could come in from the flank with a weapon weighty enough to take off an arm. I had never thought to find a staunch ally in a minstrel, but I was pleased to find in my retinue such a loyal supporter. Wilmot brandished his weapon. "Pick up your sword, I'll fight you." I was half inclined to indulge him, for I was fed up with his clodpole and his clodpole friends. But I managed to restrain my temper and reflected that murdering him was scarcely due to put outside the relief of my meat. "You have a dragon to fight first, Sir Brimley," said I, "and I after you. And we both survive, and you may wish to pursue a quarrel, I may oblige you. But until then, it seems you must endure one another." The other knight stepped forward to calm Wilmot, and eventually he jammed his sword point first in the ground and stormed off to his tent. Rufino Knott quietly put away his falchion and began again to play his guitar. I recognized the refrain to the Clover song, but not knew better than to sing it aloud. I drank the mulled wine and ate my own supper and went to my tent. I took my carving knife with me in case I needed to defend myself. I was up at dawn for a cold breakfast, warmed by a cup of brandy. But a rain squall struck us and turned the road to muck, and the party was obliged to wait a few hours for the lane to drop. During that time, King Natalie's huntsman struck out on his own and found someone who agreed to guide us to the haunts of the great worm. So before we set out, the nights dawned armor in case the great descended on us, and others kept weapons near at hand. I rode my charger Frenzy and wore the breastplate and burning it I had worn at Exton Scales, with the dimples and creases where the usurper's bullets had nearly struck me down. I had my broadsword in its scabbard, carried a pole axe across my saddle bow, and bore on my back a large shield, recommended by the Duke. I covered myself with a thick woolen cloak, which kept me warm, which my supporters would drink, with canisters of water when we were menaced by a fire dragon. More draperies covered Frenzy, and I hoped he would not grow too hot as we traveled. I took off my rings, put them in my saddlebags, and drew on thick leather gloves armored with articulated steel plates. Sir Brinley Wilmot spoke only to his servants and looked at the rest of us with cold hauteur. The squalls had passed, and water droplets that hung in the grass were turned to gems by the sun. We came upon shattered holly hedges, which our guide had said had been broken down by the dragon. The holly berries were still bright red. Torn sheep lay in the field. It is a vicious worm's art, said our guide, for it kills for sport more than it can eat. We turned into a shadowed lane with rows of hornbeam on each side, the limbs of which had grown into an arch above us and gave the impression of a tunnel. The leaves had turned, and we were bathed in the golden light as we advanced, but Francis seemed to dislike the light and rolled his eyes and snorted. I began to think he was sitting in it. Then our guide pointed out a place where one of the hornbeams had been knocked askew, and through the hornbeam pit we could see the fire drake itself lying in a field spotted with its fingers. The dragon lay in the sun on a tawny field spotted red and white with murder sheep. It rested on the grass in shimmering tumbled coils, and it seemed to gleam with shifting colors like a fire oak. I had seen that scintillation before in that great serpent that rode the storm earlier in the year, and I knew it was a sign of the supernatural power that animated the worm. The drake was difficult to look at, and I did not care to look at it directly, but only from the slant of my eye, and even then I felt uneasy, as there was an eddy in my thoughts at the touch of the extra mundane. The dragon's head, which I judged to be as long as my leg, dripped red from its overlapping fangs. Its unwinking eyes were gold, and it had a feathery mane of scarlet. Wilmot, who had won the sortilege and was the day's first sacrifice, let his servants douse him in his charger with cold water. His horse was a heavy frame chestnut, a desperate of the sort that carried knights of legend, and Wilmot was armed cap a pie, encased in shining steel from his crown to his toes, with a surcoat in his colors of green and white. He carried a lance with a green and white pennant. Water streamed off him as he rode through the hedge and onto the field. There he paused to check his gear, and spurred his destrier toward the dragon. At the last moment he lowered his lance to pierce his target. The worm's motion was so fast I could not properly see it, but the beast lunged out fast as a whip crack, and Wilmot was hurled from his seat to land in a crash of steel 4 or 5 yards away. The lance shattered into 100 splinters, and the big horse was bowled right over, landing on its back with a scream, its legs flailing in the air. Then the drake was away, whipping through the grass fast as lightning. It swarmed between beech trees landed atop a marsh dyke, and vanished in a blizzard of scarlet leaves. The rest of us stood stunned, and the Wilmot's servants dashed out of the field to succor their master, and the rest of us followed at a more thoughtful pace, contemplating what we had seen. The worm was at least 30 feet long, and as big around as a wine barrel. It moved like a snake in fast, sinuous curves, and we disagreed about whether we had seen legs. Nevertheless, the reality of the monster was far more formidable than it had presented itself in our fantasies. And as we crossed the field, we also dwelt in silence and cold introspection. When Wilmot's servants threw up his visor, we could see his eye. Yet his pale mustaches fluttered with his breath, and it seemed that he lived, despite having been rattled in his steel suit like dice in a cup, and had only been knocked loose. The desperate was lying with a broken back and unable to rise, when Wilmot's men dispatched him with a pistol shot to the brain. Now that it seemed the knight was likely to live, we all looked towards the marsh dyke where the worm had disappeared. The huntsman carefully approached the dyke, 20 yards distance from where the dragon had broken down the beach head, just in case the drake lay in ambush by his own trap. The worm had long gone, and the huntsman rode through the gap and followed the track. He came back after a brief time, and reported that the beast was 2 fields away and had taken up residence in a pear orchard. We looked at Don Lorenzo de Brett. Well, he said in his Lorraine accent, I must fight it then, yes, but I wonder how it is best to do it. Perhaps you should not ride at it directly, I said, and ride a horse more nimble than that great destrier. Some others suggested you not use the lance. The Brett brooded on the suggestion for a moment, then shook his head. I may be able to strike it in the eye. As he was a champion jouster, I suppose this was possible. Take a heavy hand weapon, said I. Have you a poleaxe or a halberd? He had not, but he had a variety of lances, a heavy broadsword, and a hand axe. He wore his heavy tilting armor without the brand guard, the extra concave steel plate bolted on the left side of the chest to serve as a kind of shield. And viewing Wilmot sprawled on the grass, he decided to have his servants mount that steel plate. This was done in a few minutes. Wilmot did not recover his wits. His servants stripped him of his armor, wrapped him in a blanket, and carried him down to the lane, where they put him in his wagon and turned for the nearest town. Now we were 10. With caution, we followed the road over the marsh dyke, which was only 3 or 4 feet tall, and then we advanced to the next hedgerow. This too was an earthen dyke topped with a row of beech trees, and our horses crunched over a carpet of fallen beech nuts as we peered between the brilliant red leaves into the pear orchard, with its trees still full of brown-skinned winter needles. The drake, bright as a beech leaf, was easy to find among the trees, its shimmering coils thrown out wide. It was at rest again, though I could not imagine that it was unaware of us, for surely we would detect the rumble of our horses' hooves on the ground and see through the 6 or 7 fathoms of serpent bodies stretched up the earth. The Brez dismounted, and his servants swathed him in a thick wool cape with a hood and poured water over it. They brought a charger to replace his turning horse and put on a log wool dress and hood, belted the surcingles, then shifted the saddle and tacked over. I wished to suggest at this point that he not go face the worm alone, but he was a proud knight of Loretto, a champion, and I decided it was not my place to say such a thing. His groom helped him into the saddle, and he chose a lance from those on offer. He was not wearing a heavy tilting helm, but a lighter basket with a fierce visor to give him a good view. And through the visor I could see his dark, frowning, thoughtful face. He was a professional, expert in combat, and I suppose he was making calculations that I could only guess at. His servants drenched his horse with water, then he took the reins in hand, turned his mount toward the gap in the beech head, and easily leaped the ducks. I think he was one of the bravest men I have ever seen. Wilmot's courage I did not rate so highly because he knew not what he was challenging, but the Brez had seen Wilmot struck down, and still he advanced alone to fight the fire brigade. I watched the fight through the leaves of the hedge. The Brez came on slowly, keeping the pear trees between himself and his quarry, and at the last second put spurs to his charger and lowered the point of his lance, and made a perfect beautiful turn around a pear tree to bring him face to face with the worm. There was a crack, the brilliant rainbow serpent coils recoiled with him in surprise, and I was sure that the Brez had struck the dragon even though the lance had broken. He threw the broken lance down, reached for his hand axe, and spun the horse about as needed. Heat is an evolution in the horse battle, and then the growth lit with flame. The fire was so bright it seemed to burn a great white hole in the world. I was blinded, and the air filled with screams. The hair on my neck rose at the sound. I blinked until my sight returned, and the first thing I saw was the horse and man both on fire galloping blindly through the grove. Knight and charger screamed alike, the Brez in a deep howl, the horse in a high-pitched shriek. They rebounded off pear trees, but came flying, leaves and winter needles tumbled to the ground in their path. I tore my eyes away from the horror to find the fire drake, which for all I knew was charging us, but the worm was flying and thrashing away through the grove. The burning gallop ended when the horse fell and pitched its riding to the ground. We rushed through the hedge as quickly as we could, but by the time we arrived, there was no longer fire, only smoke and death. The great champion of Loretto had been put to death in his coat of steel, and cooking he had smoothed his lungs to tatters. I felt a great cold void where my heart should be, for I knew not how to view the chattering of such a titan. The knight's servants had to wait for the armor to cool, and then they stripped it off the body. I wished not to look at it, nor to smell it either. I desired myself back in Howells, sipping brandy before obtaining the misty fire, with a volume of Redwood's comic verse in my lap. Yet here I and the others were forced to cope with the awful fire of a great worm ablaze from beyond the world. More than one of the Brez's servants burst into weeping at the sight of the corpse. Yet weeping, they wrapped it in a blanket and carried it away, and now we were 9. The huntsman and his guide crept after the dragon and reported that it had gone to ground in a cave. We all advanced to view the lair's entrance and saw only a baleful darkness beneath an overhanging ledge. Before the cave climbed a meadow made with grazing, dotted with fading wildflowers and the sweeping track of a worm playing on the grass. A cloud obscured the sun, and rain began to patter down. Drops ran off my helmet. According to the sortilege, there were 3 knights who had attacked the dragon before me, and their names were a testament to the erratic and often pretentious nature of Diceland spelling. Majuro, pronounced Marley, Molyneux, pronounced Molly, and Wolfartisworth, pronounced Woolsworth. I took them aside. Gentlemen, I said, I make no imputation against your courage, and neither do I make any extraordinary claims for my own bravery, but I think I might see a way to cope with this monster. If you would oblige by deferring to me, I will take your place and fight the worm myself. They looked at each other. Woolsworth scowled. He was a big man with a russet-colored beard that he tied in little ribbon tails that draped over his forehead. He
He blew a contemptuous breath through the thick mustache that overhung his lips. I will not have it said that my courage is any less than that of Don Lorenzo de Brez. This put the others in a dilemma, for even if I did not dispute their courage, it was clear that Wolsey did. Marley cast an appraising eye at the cavern. Yet I should not care to go into that cave, he said. Let us wait out the night, for the worm may come out, and then we can track it in the element. Relief descended upon me. It was the matter of courage was postponed to the next morning, which I found myself pleased to do. Truly, though I hoped to put on a brave enough face, I was no happier in facing the monster than Marley. We brought up the wagons and sumpter horses and pitched our camp on the far side of a shallow stream. It was a sober, cold, wet company that cooked its supper and went early to bed. We stood watches all night in case the break attacked, and so I stood in the dark for some hours with rain pouring off my oilskins and my poleaxe in my hand. I knew not what we would do if the worm attacked other than die. The rain faded before sunrise, and we cooked our pottage and porridge over damp, smoky wood, while gray clouds steamed high in the firmament. We wrapped blankets for warmth, shaking the water out of our possessions, and the very breath of our horses in the chill air. No one seemed very eager for battle. Yet, when there was no longer any reason for delay, we began to arm and mount our horses. Marley resolutely avoided my eyes. We crossed the stream and began to climb the hill that led to the meadow of the cavern. The grass had rebounded and no longer showed the track of the fire grate, and there were no new tracks, so Queen Natalie's huntsman pronounced his opinion that the worm was still in the cave. Marley looked out from beneath his visor at the entrance, shadowed by the great overhanging ledge. Don Lorenzo may have mortally wounded. I think it maybe did. No one replied. Marley took a halberd and stepped into the field. He was not a jouster and was dressed as a deputy trooper, with a breastplate over a thick suede buff coat and a bergonet with full visor. He already wore a cloak for warmth, but he threw the hood over his head and let his men drench him with water. This did not help the Brez, but perhaps Marley would be more lucky. He could not ride his charger into the cave, so he left his horse in the lane and advanced on foot. His cloak swept a dark trail on the dew-bright grass. He did not aim directly for the cave, but took a roundabout way so as to avoid alerting the dragon. When he neared the entrance, he crouched low and peered around the corner into the darkness. Whatever he saw must have encouraged him to crept forward and prepare to descend into the cavern. The cave lit up bright as the sun, and when the bright moons faded from our eyes, Marley was gone, leaving behind only that dark trail in the grass. Now we were 8. We looked at each other in silence, and I turned to Molyneux. Sir, I repeat my office of yesterday, I said. If you will defer to me in the succession, I will do my best to bring the worm to heel. Wolsey made a scornful sound. For you to advance, he said to me, 2 knights will have to give way, and Molyneux may, but I will not. I will not let it be said that you have more courage than I. Sir Edward Wesley tried to intervene. It is not a question of courage, sir, he said. It is a question of killing this dragon. We have not laid a finger on this beast, and 3 men have died. It is not cowardice to admit that our plan has failed and that we should attempt something else. Wolsey folded his arms across his big chest and blew a contemptuous gust through his overhanging mustache. I will not yield my place. There was a silence. Well then, said Molyneux, cavaliers, rescue Mary. I must hope that my shield will serve. Again, we went through the business of breaking and dousing one of our number, and Molyneux strapped on his shield and cut down lance in his right hand using a short stabbing spear. The shield was no small buckler, but a large wooden mantlet of the kind used in sieges for handgunners to hide behind. Molyneux had covered it with rawhide to keep it from bursting into flame. I viewed the unwieldy port of the wall and thought it might serve as good protection against anything but the unworldly fires of the worm. He watched with sinking hearts as he lumbered over the grass carrying his wooden wall. He dropped it on the grass before the cave, I think, to catch his breath, and then he picked up the great shield and advanced upon the cave. No fire jetted forth, and Molyneux stepped over the threshold and vanished into the shadows. We waited. We were 7. I turned to Wolsey. Well, sir, I said, your turn has come at last. I wish you joy in it. He looked up at the cave beneath its overhang. His face had gone pale, and his eyes seemed big as blue platters. Molyneux may have yet to engage. He said we should give him more time. He may be in trouble, said I. You will have the honor of rescuing him. He blew out his breath through his thick mustache. Let us have dinner first. I fight better on a full belly. Nay, said I, it is your turn. He insisted on taking your place, and you would not yield to another. Now you must follow Marley and Molyneux. I pointed to the cave. After you've gone into the dark tube that awaits you, I may do what I should have done first thing this morning before 2 brave men died. I say again, Wolsey insisted, that I fight better on a full belly. I've had a belly full of you, cried Don Memory. By the pilgrim's nose, must I throw you into the cave myself? The wide blue eyes turned confused. I have an idea that may serve. Wolsey threw up his hands in the air. at Sir Gulliver's insistence, said I will yield my place to him. I snarled at him. The time to yield your place was an hour ago. Wolsey folded his arms across his armored breast. I have decided, he said. You may have my place. It is at your own request. Coward, said Don Membrino. Turd. Wolsey scowled at him. These aspersions are immaterial. Once I have chosen, I am immovable. I'll move you. The Loretta Knight punched him over the ear with an armored fist. Wolsey clapped a hand to his head and breathed. Fight me or fight the worm, said Don Membrino, but I tell you, I am more terrible. Perhaps I inadvertently saved Wolsey from being massacred because I seized him by his gorget and the skirt of his cuirass and hurled him through the hornbeam hedge and onto the field where he fell in a crash of steel. I threw his burgonet after him. Draw your sword, I said, and get you to the cave. Never have I been so inclined to commit murder. Wolsey picked himself up. These affronts are unbecoming, uncivil, and refractory, he said. I have done nothing to provoke them, but accede to Sir Gulliver's request. Oh, I've had enough, said Sir Elmere, and reached out to one of the holsters on his courser and drew out a pistol nearly as long as his arm. He cocked it and pointed it at Wolsey's head. Go to the cavern, sir, or die here in the field. They were fools, you might say, with that narrow look in your eyes, and you were perfectly correct. I had nothing to do with these high-born toss-strung cavaliers, and I never wished to be in their company. It was of no consequence to me if any of them died or if they killed each other. But when all is considered, it were better if Wolsey died fighting the dragon than be cut down about his friend. Wolsey stared at the pistol barrel pointed between his eyes, and then he shrugged into the air through his overhanging mustache. If you insist, he said, I will retrieve the matter, and you may surrender all the glory to me. He put on his helmet and dropped his visor over his face. He did not bother to clad himself in wet wool, but drew his sword and marched out onto the grass. From the center of the meadow, he paused to survey the cave before him, and crouched and went off on a slant like Marley, as if to take the cave by surprise. Yet when he reached the hedge that bounded the meadow, he did not begin to move along toward the cave, but climbed over the marsh dyke and vanished, leaving behind only a few beech boughs waving in the wind. I stared after Wolsey for a few seconds, and then I could not help but burst into laughter. He has gone for his dinner, I said. Sir Elmer laughed as well. Well, the way got fusty and has fled, he walked a howl with my blessing. It seemed that we were now saints. Wolsey's servants were abashed at their master's flight and seemed not to know what to do. Bide here for a while, I told them. You may yet be of service. Sir Elmer looked at me. Well, Sir Gulliver, as Wolsey is Fubio, it seems the lottery is fallen at last upon you. At last I would be allowed to do what I intended to do from the first. All it had cost was the lives of 3 men. I turned to my followers. Come, my brave engineers, you know your business. They busied themselves in my wagon. 2 men brought out the carriage on their backs, and the strongest carried the leather-wrapped barrel. The cart's driver and Rufino Knott followed bowling the spoke wheels before them. The wheels were fixed on the axles, and then the gun was dropped onto the carriage, and the cap squares bolted over the trunnion. In swift order, the ammunition was laid out before the gun, and the sponge, worm, and ram were laid on the grass nearby. The cartridges were brought out in a wooden bucket to keep the damp from the powder. 2 of my sailors stripped the canvas top from the wagon, and the pair of spool guns were fixed on the quarters, and the slow matches lit. Frank long ago decided that Colonel Lipton's leather gun deserved a field trial against the dragon. Firing its fire, to that end, had acquired a crew from the loyal and worshipful company of cannoneers, 3 apprentices under the command of the Lancashire field. While the cannon was being ready, I put my cloak about myself and consented to a drenching, and Frenchie dressed so also. He misliked this and snorted in anger. I stayed away from his rolling eyes and threatening hooves, planted my full axe in the ground, and returned to the dungeon. He'll handed me the linstock with 2 burning matches set in its tip. Load first with a carcass goodman fever, I said. A cartridge and flannel bag filled with costly corn powder was rammed down the short barrel and then a wad. The carcass, sticky with tar, was rammed down next, and there was no need for a second wad, for the barrel was tilted upward and the munition would not roll out. Field pushed the vent prick into the touch hole to pierce the cartridge, then lifted his powder horn and poured fine corn powder into the hole. I peered along the barrel. A little to the left, Goodman. One of the crew used a handspike to throw the trailer in. He looked along the barrel himself and adjusted the elevation with the corn. I do not blush to admit that it was he who actually laid in command of the gun. Being a professional with worked with Mowbray, I lived in the weapons development. I held the linstock and pretended for the sake of my dignity to be in charge. The knights looked at me with great surprise. Yet there had been a cannon for 200 years or more, for all that no one had entered legend through the use of such a weapon against a great monster. Gentlemen, I told them, it may be that the gun may provoke the worm to attack us. In that case, we should retire behind the wagons and let my shipmates here fly at peace with their murderers. And if the drake continues to vex us, I think we should then attack it altogether. The worm is so long, each of us will have a fathom servant to ourselves, to humans we men. I looked along the short barrel again. The range was about 75 yards, which was point blank, even for a small field piece, and we could scarcely miss. I reached out to the linstock. "Stand back, friends," I said, and the gunners stepped away and clapped their hands over their ears. Standing well to the side, I touched the priming powder with one of the burning matches on the linstock, and the gun went off with a clap and bounded back 4 or 5 feet. I was trying to spot the follow shot, and I saw the carcass strike the underside of the overhanging ledge and rebound into the cave. Gunpowder scent stung the air. Fields proved weak for their work. The gun was rolled back into position. The sponge was dunked in water and run down the barrel to douse the burning flannel or tar, and another cartridge ran down and then a wad. Theo looked at me, a silent question on his attentive face. By the moment, Goodman said, I was ready to round shot. Tendrils of smoke began to rise from the cave. The carcass was a type of ball shot covered with tar and filled with a mixture of sulfur, tallow, saltpeter, antimony, and other tools of the alchemist. In sieges, they would be used to set fire to buildings, but I was interested more in the possibility of suffocation. I looked at the knights and grinned. "We'll see if the worm needs to breathe," said I. Billows of white smoke rose from the cave. Perhaps fire was the drake's natural element, and it was basking in the flames, like a dolphin dozing on the sun-kissed waves. But I thought the worm seemed more like an antelope than an alchemist's salamander, and not care to breathe sulfur for long. I waited until the smoke began to grow thin, and then I fired a second carcass in the worm's lair. The art of making these munitions is inexact, but this particular carcass seemed more successful than the last, for the smoke fairly gushed from the cave with a great hissing noise. The leather gun was loaded with cartridge and wad, and I had it trained on the cavern entrance. 2 gunners stood by, one carrying another carcass, another a round shot. I stuck the butt of the lidstock in the ground, took my telescope out of its case, and viewed the mouth of the beast's lair. I hoped that I did not have to fire more than once or twice more, for Linton had told me that his guns always burst sooner or later. Yet he had assured me that this particular gun was an improvement on the others, and I tried to take some comfort in that. It was difficult to see anything properly amid the gushing, swirling gray smoke, but a surge of blood prickled my arms as I thought I saw a dark shadow bob up in the cavern entrance and then duck down again. I said nothing and waited until the worm to more plainly show itself. Then the drake heaved its great coils out of the cave and appeared in plain sight, its rainbow colors shimmering against the smoke, its head bobbing to try to make out its surroundings. Perhaps it was blinded by the sun, or the smoke had brought tears to its eyes. It was still about 75 yards away, point blank range, even for a small gun. "Round shot!" I cried. The 6-pound ball was rammed down the leather gun's short barrel. I looked at Theo and gave a silent command with my eyes, and he jumped behind the gun to train. His crew made a few fine adjustments, and Theo pushed the point in to lower the barrel. "Now, sir," he said, and I brought the lidstock down. The gun bounded back with a crash, and I saw the ball strike the worm just below its neck. For a brief moment, there was a frantic writhing, like a nest of snakes that had been speared with a stick, and then the drake fell still. I ran for my frenzy and found Rufino not ready, bent over with his hands cut. I put my boot into his hands, and he threw me up into the saddle. I reached for my bullet. "Great, a top round shot," I called, in case my next stroke failed, and struck spurs to my horse. Frenzy gave a ferocious snort and bounded up the meadow. The gunshots and the taste of powder had perhaps reminded my steed of his warhorse days, for he seemed more angry and more animated than he had in years. The gallop was over in an instant, and the fire break was stretched before us. The sulphur scent tainted the air. The body, with its shimmering rainbow scales, lay slack in its coils, and the beast's scarlet mane stretched on the damp grass. The faint mouth snapped in the air, and the golden eyes rolled toward me, filled with malevolence. The drake was not dead, but stunned. I realized that I had dropped out of the saddle. I had forgotten my large shield and could not stand the beast's fire, and therefore I should not give it the chance to breathe on. I jumped behind the head somewhat, raised the poleaxe in both hands, and brought the axe blade down on the fire drake's neck, with the intention of severing the spine. The blade bit deep, and the serpent's great coils leaped up from the ground and snapped like whips. I jumped back to be pulled over, and frenzy reared and struck the coils with its fingers. I did my best to locate the head of the coiling chaos and struck again with the axe blade. The fire drake fell still, one golden eye staring at the sun. I stood with the poleaxe cocked, ready to strike again, but the scale's rainbow colors were already fading as the magic passed away. Frenzy struck the worm with a disdainful hook that snorted and backed away. The last of the carcass smoke drifted away, and I viewed the dead animal at my feet and saw that it had 4 small, rather delicate clawed feet. They seemed too weak to support the worm's great weight, and there were recesses in the body with which might be touched. When the beast writhed on its way like a snake. I suppose the claws were used in climbing or dismembering prey. There were also the remains of 2 leathery wings. They had been enough, I suppose, to support the young drake in its flight to Manila, but the carcass sustaining once it had reached its full growth. "Hurrah for Sir Quilifer!" The 2 sailors in the wagon led the cheers and fired their swivel guns into the air. "A salute to Sir Quilifer!" I began the business of cutting off the dragon's head. Its eye cord was dark and glittered like black diamonds. By the time I had severed the head, the other knights arrived, having walked up from the living with many of their servants. They marveled at the beast and pulled on its tail to stretch it to its full length. I had been nearly right that each knight would have a fathom of work in it, for it was 10 or 12 paces long. One of the servants came forward with a knife to dig the teeth from the dragon's jaw, and I told him to step away. The head is a gift for Her Majesty, said I. I shall deliver it entire. I looked up and saw Sir Edward in front of me. This is what you planned all along, he said. Aye. We just got in your way. I had no answer for that. Fortunately, with these idiots, Florian said, and Philip was sleeping off the feast. That was near enough to what had happened. The cannon moved, and I jumped at the sound, which was followed by the whine of brass shot singing. In salute, Peter fired the gun harmlessly toward the next field, but the weapon had burst out its double charge of roundabout and great, and some pieces of its barrel sawn through the air. None of us was hurt, but I sagged with relief that I had not had to fire the gun a fourth time. And then I felt my heart lift. I had killed the deadly worm in the world of pestilent choice. Notice.
Okay. I have questions as well, but I wanted to ask, so I'm trying to read as much of your stuff as I could leading up to this, right? And so one thing that struck me about the range of elective work is the time and space to take the bureaucracy and details there. And I'm thinking like in Pulitzer and where you spend time with kind of legal bureaucracy of the kind of relative Renaissance and the military bureaucracy, Congress, and even to an extent, kind of corporate other types of bureaucracy and hardwire, and even in this is not a game. And so I'm just struck by, is what do you see as the use of those kind of details and bureaucracy is laid out kind of narrative?
Well, that's my approach to the world building. Because I think if you're writing fantasy and somebody's got a sword, what I do is I think, where did that sword come from? And who made it? And how much did it cost? And so on. And you do this with everything that your character touches. And since Quillifer has ambition to rise in government and to be the head of a department or two, then he's having to deal with departmental issues. And even under the Tudors, the government was a massive problem with lots of problems. Just the royal household itself was a huge bureaucracy with thousands of people involved in direct service to the monarch. And they all had warrants for what they did. They all had titles. They all had jobs. One of the things I found is what's a page? Right? A page is traditionally, I've learned this time, it's a young boy who is learning how to be a knight. But page was actually a job description. You could have a 60-year-old page. It was just, if you were a page, you had these duties. And so, I don't know, I find the details of administration kind of interesting, and I try to make them interesting for the reader. And it adds to the personality. I remember reading, back years ago, I read, James Bond. It was out there with his girlfriend, and that's kind of it. And doing all this very do. And then I read John Le Carre. John Le Carre, if something happens, well, send somebody up to get the file. And get these other files while he's up there. And so a lot of Le Carre is about the administration of being a spy. That you have to read the files, you have to generate reports, you have to plan budgets. If you're going to send James Bond off, you need to get some kind of special warrant so that James Bond can afford to fly out to Jamaica and defeat Scaramanga or whoever his villain of the week is. And I think those details are really interesting. I mean, you don't want to write a whole book that way.
So to pull on to that question then, I think your answer to the question sort of had me answer my question, which is that having read lots and lots of your work across all sorts of genres, you have Pulitzer, you have the space opera. The practice, just a game provided. I feel like there's like a fingerprint of your work, even though you do so many different things, that there's always like a wit to what you write. There's like even when you're writing in different voices, there's like a distinct kind of a sly wit in the observation form. And I wondered if that's deliberate because you get to a point you just can't resist it, or if it's something you do subconsciously. And I think maybe part of that is coming from the fact that we can disrupt things.
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you for the compliment. And I mean, I probably can't. Something in the situation strikes me as absurd or funny, and I'll point that out. So yeah, that's.
But I do realize now sometimes it comes to these passages where you're deconstructing these bureaucracy.
Yeah. Well, and in this case, the eccentric spellings of the three nuns.
Yeah.
Right. Which are really how those things are fascinating, even though they're not spelled that way at all. And then when you get to Scottish spellings, that's just nothing about it. Just say the words.
Any other questions?
So I remember you saying this yesterday, and I know we told me before about how many books is it full per series?
It is planned out to 6 books.
And how much have you managed to get under contract? So,
Just these three.
okay. Everybody buy those three. Please.
Yeah,
So
they'll
they'll
get
get
10,000 close to 20,000. They could use it. This is, I think the last 2 books they have not bothered to send out review copies. Probably got lost in this absurd bureaucracy. So the only reviews of these last 2 books I've seen were in Wellness Magazine, which has muscle to actually get a review copy out of them.
And people don't necessarily realize that series get canceled all the time. It's very common for people to want the whole series to be out before they buy it.
Yeah.
But the market doesn't work that way. Buy it, put it on a shelf, wait until all 6 are out if you want to do it that way.
Each book is different enough. You won't miss it if the series is finished. You'll still love what you got.
And I have a pretty strong feeling I know where it ends, and I really want to see that journey as he gets through.
Okay. Yeah, this starts with Walter 18. He's maybe, see, I just read, he's maybe 22. And it will go till he's, I would say an elderly person, until he's advanced mature age.
Well, the titles, I think, do speak to a certain arc. Starts school for the circle for Lord Gulliver. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions? Yes.
So, yes, I've also read quite a few, most of your work, because I
I'm
have
sorry,
a
could you speak up? The mask is kind
I've also read quite a lot of your work, since I lived with somebody who was a massive fan. And I have noticed in almost all your lead characters that it's almost always almost Horatio Alger type character, except with a lot more cynicism than the usual Horatio Alger story. Is this a conscious effort, or is this just, that's the kind of character I'm drawn to?
Well, one of my themes is power, and how you get power, and how you keep power, and what it's like not to have power.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to explore all sides of that. In the Praxis books, the 2 main characters, one of them is essentially provincial nobility. Right, that he's rich, and he's immense amounts of privilege, but he just is not in the top rank of the top rank. Let him forget it. But in actuality, he's fine, But and the other character is a girl from the streets who has taken the place of one of the highest names in the empire. Right, so she's an imposter. And she has all the privilege in the world. But she's not the person who actually should be having the privilege. So, and so she gets to explore both of the elements of it. So, but I mean, I have written about people who are on the top. Gabriel and Aristotle, for example, is an absolute ruler of his domain. And some of the others. So it's, I try to look at it from all perspectives. But yeah, it is not uncommon in genre to have a lowly protagonist. And sometimes to overcome all of the sort of social prejudices, as well as whatever the problems have. It hadn't occurred to me in comparison with Horatio Alger. That's Horatio Alger story takes place in a far more benign universe than I ever experienced. All you need to do is get the right rich man to give you things. And you too can rise in the world.
Any other questions?
Your Days of Atonement. What other? I'm thinking of your work and the works that have been influenced by your home here in Mexico. And Days of Atonement. That's the sheriff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Where else does New Mexico enter your work? Either directly or
Okay. Well, see, I realized that. Okay, I saw the movie that Robert Redford made of a lot of reviews before.
Yeah.
And I also read the reviews by people who don't live here, and they all went, they have no idea what Robert Redford is trying to do with this. And it was magical realism, but they didn't know what that was. And also, I thought that book was just about my neighbors.
Yeah.
It's just ordinary life. And I realized that New Mexico is an alien planet. And you're going to write about it, but people who don't live here. I have the tools to write about alien worlds, and so I did that. But I thought I'm only going to have one book about New Mexico. And so this is a book in which I put everything. New Mexico turns up, oddly enough, in the practice that Gareth Martinez's home world was essentially settled by people from northern New Mexico, with all of their social apparatus transferring more or less intact. And so, the patron-client system and all of that was brought over directly from that part of the world. And I put, they're penitentiaries. Right? And he's baffled by it. He has no idea what this is about. But they live under the sun and stuff. And I know we're supposed to persecute them, but really it's not really. But there are probably some bits in New Mexico here. Well, actually, I don't think it's in our market. A lot of our market takes place in and was inspired by the trilogy, but through churches, back home churches was kind of a dangerous place to be found. I mean, now it's an arts colony. I couldn't believe it when it was last there. But the churches used to be very dangerous for outsiders. There was a state policeman who went missing, to serve a warrant or something that was never heard of again. The first person to die in the New Mexico prison riots was from churches, and he died because they thought he was a weird dog. It's like, okay, we busted out of jail, let's kill the witch. They went there. That was the first thing. anyway, I have cowboy in that book, and I can see, and I remember that there was a church or a parada or some kind of religious institution, and it had an arch above the door, and in that arch, there was like 9 in the pyramid. I remember it very clearly. And then when I came back to preach more recently, I couldn't find it. I couldn't find the building. You know, it's clearly gone off into some alternate universe. And I talked about driving to the fort and I was like, there's a bridge there now. So that's, you know, a detail that's kind of grew off. Is there any other questions?
All right, well then, please join me in thanking Walter for his work.